We ready? Good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Amcrott. I'm the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session of our 2018 Northeast Ohio Public Policy Series. Tonight's program addresses redistricting. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I want to recognize and thank a few organizations who were especially instrumental in making tonight's program possible and our entire public policy series possible. Our program partners are the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University, the League of Women Voters, Northeast Ohio Media Group, the Cuyahoga County Public Library, the Heights Library, and the Lakewood Public Library. We are also grateful to our corporate sponsor, First Interstate Properties, for supporting this series. I want to remind everyone about our next session, which will be on single-payer healthcare, moderated by Ginger Christ of the Plain Dealer. This session will be held April 25th at the Lakewood Public Library, and May 16th, we will be having a session on women in politics at the Heights Library main branch. You can find information about all of these programs on our website and also through the League of Women Voters. During the question and answer session of today's program, please write out your questions on the note cards, and someone will be around to collect those cards during the program. If you need a card, raise your hand. If you have a card ready to be picked up, please raise your hand. It is with great pleasure that we welcome our moderator for this evening, Rich Exner, who is a Cleveland.com reporter, and Rich will be introducing our panelists. Rich is a data analysis editor for Cleveland.com. He has written dozens of stories over the past several months analyzing the ill effects of gerrymandering, not the positive effects of gerrymandering. He has also looked at best case models for reform from other states and the fixes proposed for Ohio. His series, Out of Line, Impact 2017 and Beyond, was the leading Ohio news media voice on the issue over the last year. Before joining Cleveland.com in 2013, Rich was a reporter and editor at The Plain Dealer and United Press International. He is a journalism graduate of Ohio State University. Please join me in a warm welcome for Rich Exner, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you very much. I hope that we can have an informal but informative conversation. We've got some of the experts in the field tonight. One of the neat things about being a journalist is you get to talk to a lot of really smart people and get free college education beyond college, because you get to talk to some of the very brightest people in each field, and we have some of them here tonight. David Daley, if you haven't gone to a local library, he's written a book that is really an encyclopedia of how it's come to be. My mom taught me not to say these things in public, but David, tell us about your book. David, who used to work for Salon magazine and other publications, tell us about your book real briefly and how you came to be here in terms of this topic.
Sure. I was the editor of Salon throughout 2012, 2013, and we were covering just the wildness that was happening in Washington. Government shutdowns, vote after vote on Obamacare, repeals that clearly weren't going to be signed into law by the president it was named for. And one morning I said, gee, I wonder why the Democrats didn't take back the House in 2012 when President Obama got reelected and Democrats took back the Senate. Well, it turns out the Democrats got 1.4 million more votes in 2012 for the U.S. House than Republicans did, but Republicans held on to a 234-201 advantage in the chamber. And I said, well, that's really strange. And I looked at it a little bit deeper, and I said, really? So Pennsylvania sends 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. And Ohio sends 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And North Carolina is 10-3. And these are the bellwether swing states. These are the most competitive states in the country. And if you were to add up North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, it's 49 Republicans and 20 Democrats, and not a single one of those seats has swung red to blue all decade. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. How did this happen? And I went back and I found a really interesting Republican strategy called REDMAP, which is short for the Redistricting Majority Project. And essentially, This is a story that begins after the 2008 election, in which Barack Obama is first elected, and Democrats take a supermajority in the U.S. House and in the U.S. Senate. And if you go back and look at the TV coverage of election night, there are the smartest minds in politics on every channel from all sides are saying that the Republican Party was going to be a minority party for decades to come. Didn't exactly turn out that way, did it? And a handful of really smart Republican strategists realized that a redistricting is coming in 2010, and that the 2010 redistricting in many ways offered a path back to power for the party, that the 2010 election could be more consequential than 2008 because every 10 years after the census, we redraw all of the state legislative lines and all of our congressional lines. And in most states, it's the state legislature that's got the power over both of these processes. So what the Republicans did, and this is all perfectly legal, it could have been done by anybody. I'm not up here pointing partisan fingers one way or another. But they studied the process. They studied the laws in every state, and they said, how can we be sure that we have got every seat at the table when it comes time to draw the next set of maps in 2011, especially in these swing states, especially in states that are going to lose or gain a seat through reapportionment once the census is conducted. They targeted 117 local state legislative races across 16 states. And by targeting and winning those races, Republicans had the power to draw on their own, unilaterally, nobody else in the room, with the most sophisticated computer modeling and big data software that has ever been used in districting, 193 of the 435 U.S. House seats. That gives you a pretty good advantage towards the 218 you need for a majority. And this is where we are. Districting and redistricting, it explains why our politics is so extreme, why it is so broken, why our districts feel so uncompetitive. And it is a huge reason why we are in the place we are in, a 50-50 country, a deeply divided country, but one in which all of the political power at the national level and at the state level is in the hands of one side.
Thank you, David. So we can see the passion that somebody has when they find out about something and wants to tell the story. Our second guest here tonight, Gregory Moore, is the executive director of the NAACP National Voter Fund. And from your view, what have you seen happening, or why is it of interest to you?
Well, first, let me thank you all for being here in a standing room only crowd to talk about redistricting. And that's something I thought I'd never see. I am the executive director of the NAACP National Voter Fund, but I'm also a native of Cleveland, Ohio, and have spent my entire adult life outside of Ohio. But as Katherine knows, I come back quite a bit. In fact, I call Ohio my home, depending on the type of year it is. And the reason this is important to me is that we've watched the trends across the country on how the Voting Rights Act has been really eviscerated by the U.S. Supreme Court. We've watched how legislatures across the country, after we lost the case Shelby v. Holder, that these supermajority legislators really began to roll back many of the voting rights that we had fought for a long time. The early votes, the work around provisional ballots being counted properly, making voting easier, central voting locations, all these things we were pushing forward here in Ohio and around the country were being rolled back. And these supermajorities in these legislators were the main reason why that was happening. We seem to be lost and stuck in this place of not being able to stop it. When Katherine and others, and Katherine and I have worked on 2 or 3 of these, and she's going to talk, she's the real star of this, this great initiative that actually had success. In Washington, there was very little sense of optimism about this possibility. In fact, when it was first announced that there would be an effort, We basically sat back and waited for the process to unfold. And as things began to fall apart, pretty much as you maybe follow from the Cleveland Plain Dealer and other publications, it was the advocacy groups, it was the League of Women Voters, and it was Common Cause, and it was the NAACP and others who had basically stayed out and continued collecting signatures. And she's going to talk about that. But we actually got invited to the table and became a part of that negotiation process, much to my surprise. And all my skeptical friends in Washington said, Greg, can you go back home and help with this? And I did come back, and I worked from, I believe, December and all of January and up until the very last day when the threshold for this initiative was had a deadline, which was the 7th of February. So the legislature had until the 7th of February to get this together and put something on the ballot for May, or they would lose the window to do this. So the skeptics in Washington, D.C., I think began to look at this effort in Ohio and really said, good luck. And then the tape self-destructed. You know, good luck, Greg. Give it your best shot. But as Katherine can attest, we spent the better part of the holidays and all the January and really as much as we could up into that last few days, making sure we had this ballot initiative process in a place where we could actually embrace it. And so the model that Katherine's going to talk about, I am trying to make the case that we've looked at the Arizona model, we looked at the California model, now they're looking at the Pennsylvania model when you go to court and hope the Supreme Court will save you. This Ohio model is something that I think we will be talking about for years to come. And the experts, like my friend here, will be writing about this Ohio model for a long time. But the key to this Ohio model is that we have to get it past the May 8th election. And so there were not a lot of people who had a lot of hope that this would go very far. And so we don't have those same troops lined up like we did over these last several cycles to get this bill passed. In fact, we thought we were going to be working on a ballot measure in November with the petition drive that the coalition, Fair Districts Coalition, has put together. But we now find ourselves with less than 2 months to pull this off. So when we get to the Q&A section, I want to talk about this importance of this campaign, but also just lift up the name of Vernon Sykes and Kenny Yoko and other people who have been fighting this battle, but also the Republicans who, and I have to admit, I've worked on Capitol Hill and I've negotiated voting rights legislation, and it's been tough, but this was one of the most intense negotiations we've ever had, and many, many times Republicans walked away from the table, but they came back each time. And we thought they would just keep walking, and they did come back, and for some reason, we had a bipartisan effort that passed unanimously in the Senate, and with only 10 less votes in the House. So it's completely, absolutely bipartisan, and because of that, I won't say a single bad thing about Republicans tonight until the end of the show. Thank you.
I'm curious, with all these people here tonight, how many of you actually circulated petitions for this effort? So there's a number of you here. And that doesn't surprise me, because at a couple of the public hearings, when after all the petitions were being circulated, the legislature, after years of not really doing anything other than, I think it was the former head of the League of Women Voters said that nothing more than lip service over the years that started moving. But there were 2 public hearings, and it was just filled with people who came down, and they didn't say, do this because I think this is right. They all came with stories that they picked up from people and circulating their petitions, and it was kind of amazing. But the person, well, you guys will probably know her, Katherine Tercer, is one of the groups, the head of one of the groups behind this Common Cause Ohio, along with the League of Women Voters and the Ohio Environmental Council. Mm-hmm. But I guess I'd be interested, just kind of set the stage tonight. Katherine Tercer, this isn't the first time around on this thing. So there's other things when this came up short and so forth. Maybe if you could let us know briefly about some of those other efforts and why maybe this one was different.
Well, as many of you, I'm sure, know, the tale of redistricting reform is a tale of heartbreak. In the late 90s, a woman named Terry McCoy came up to me. She had in tow a woman named Peggy Rosenfield. And you all probably might recognize those names. These were 2 long-term League of Women Voter advocates. And I was at Ohio Citizen Action at that point, so I've been working on kind of money and politics, and so they started walking me through gerrymandering, and I had to be like, yeah, 8th grade social studies. And then, like many of us, I had that like aha moment where it was so clear to me that cheating, playing around with those district lines, was a way to invalidate the will of voters. That in fact, the manipulation of those district lines is the manipulation of our vote. The manipulation of our vote manipulates the policies. And we're all poorer for not being able to hold those folks accountable. And, you know, so for me, I've always wanted this to be about giving voters a voice. Because I believe that we should actually be able to participate in real elections. That, in fact, we need to have more competitive races, and addressing redistricting reform is one of the ways that we can do this. So I'm going to take us back to 1981. Okay, I know. So I was in middle school in 1981, so it's been a little while. But this is the thing that to remember is the very first redistricting reform effort where citizens gathered signatures was in 1981. And they got their butts kicked. In this particular case, the Republicans were in favor of reform because they were out of power. Ooh, I ran across this really cool letter where Jim Rhodes sent a letter to Benson Woolman, if you remember him from the ACLU, right? And so in our records, basically making the case, in fact, that this is a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's a power issue, right? This is all about power and wielding power. And who should actually have that power? Us. We deserve to have that power. So it was actually really, all sorts of interesting things when you start to think that, during our story of reform in 1981, the Republicans were with us. By 2005, the story was really different. And there was a big effort in 2005. Anyone else remember what happened in 2005? So you're thinking, you're thinking Gore v. Bush. I was thinking about CoinGate. Does anybody remember CoinGate? So there was all this chaos, and it seemed like the perfect moment to talk about how do we hold people more accountable. Let's deal with redistricting reform. Now, what was good that came out of this, shall we say, butt kicking, because we did lose. We did lose. Was that in fact we ended up having early vote because the legislature said, hey, what can we do to cut this thing off the knees? And so they legislatively passed early vote, which was part of the package. And so as you go to early vote, or you do null fault absentee through the mail, know that that was because of a citizen initiative. All right, so the other thing that 2005 got us is a conversation about, hey, this is something that we need to actually move legislatively. John Husted became a good kind of champion for it at that point. We still didn't get it done. In 2009, we had a measure passed in the House and a measure in 2010, Senate, and they weren't the same ones. And so we still didn't get reform before we got to the 2011 map making. And we also know that 2012, how many people here collected signatures in 2012? And we got our butts kicked. We got our butts kicked. But because of a couple, I know you wouldn't say but, would you? The title of his book makes me clutch my pearls. But because of those, I was teasing Greg. I was telling him about failing forward. Like every time you are not successful, you learn something and you move forward. And I don't know if you noticed the number of people that collected and the number of people that collected in 2017 was dramatically different, right? It was dramatically different, the numbers. So we've made tremendous progress in terms of educating people and engaging people. And 2017 was a really interesting year because we had this resurgence of interest in the principles of democracy at the same time as... Ba-dum-bum. At the same time as we had this interest in addressing redistricting reform, and Greg is absolutely right. You know, I've done citizen initiatives before with millions of dollars. I've never done it like this way, which is like we have a room, let's put on, you know, we have a barn, let's put on a show. There have been times where it really did feel like that. Well, let's organize people to collect. And I do want to say, you know, thank you to all the people who helped, whether they were collecting signatures or validating petitions or just having a conversation with their neighbors. We're all part of the story now. And we deserve to have a voice. And so as we leave today, make sure you say hello to your neighbor. Ask them what they've done about redistricting reform. Because we should start to think about what is democracy, what is we the people. And we have to participate not just on election day, but all year long. And on that note, Rich is looking like he's ready to take me off. Do y'all remember the Gong Show? I know some of you are too young.
Well, one thing that happens in the newspaper business or website business these days is people get the chance to comment anonymously a lot of times on stories. So just want to address some of the things that come up all the time and some of the things that they've heard as to why you can't change the process. Like, for instance, and it was actually in one of the proposals for the Senate, is that the districts have to be exactly the number of people. And why would you want to do that? Well, then I guess it justifies, if you want every district to be exactly the same number of people, then that justifies, oh, I got to split this city and that split it. And it makes it a lot easier to start splitting. But that's not true, as much as it can be is said out there. There are, I think what I write down, 11 states that don't have the exact same number of people. And then there was a Supreme Court case in West Virginia where they showed the variation of, I think it was close to 4,000 or so. So that's one of the myths that's out there on that. One of the other myths that comes up every time I'd mention this, and maybe if you guys circulate in the petitions, you heard this from people, we certainly would hear all the time from people that didn't want things to change, is that you have to, one of the reasons why the maps look so funny is you have to have a majority black district or majority minority district. But the people that study this, that are lawyers, are a lot smarter than me, keep telling me, no, that's not the case. And in fact, they point to a recent Supreme Court case that was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in a North Carolina case that points out that, no, you're not supposed to have quotas and so forth. You're supposed to have competitive districts, and competitive means maybe a lower threshold of the minority, because what's the alternative to a district that's designed to pump up the numbers of a minority group while you've hemmed them in one spot, and all of a sudden they don't have a voice elsewhere. And anybody from Northeast Ohio is familiar with the district that runs from Cleveland all the way down to Akron. And truth be told, at least the legal people said, they tell me that really didn't need to be that way. You could have a district that could have really had a good chance to elect a minority representative without going that way. And I'm just telling out the myths here. One of the other one is that the debate this time started off by one of the state senators insisting it can't be done by anyone but the state legislature because the U.S. Constitution says it has to be that way. But the people that follow it know, of course, that there was an Arizona case that made that clear. The U.S. Supreme Court's clear on that you can have an independent commission, and that there are independent commissions being used in some states, and then a place like Iowa uses an agency that has a lot of rules. So what do you do in the process if you don't have an independent commission doing it, if you have the legislature doing it? I guess the best bet is to have lots of rules. They call them guardrails sometimes, so people don't stray too far from what's right or wrong. And that's really what the fight was about here in the final days, I think, in the State House. The things that were going on behind the scenes in Columbus is because the legislature was looking at this, and they had a proposal that maybe some people in the legislature didn't like, or for whatever reason didn't want to get to the ballot in November. They were talking about racing to the ballot ahead of time in May, and people like Katherine Tercer, and I didn't know that Mr. Moore was involved in that then. It sounds like you came in on that. So maybe you can provide us the insight. What got it from the proposal that the Common Cause, Legal Women Voters, and others thought was the right way to go in November to something that was acceptable? What was some of that give and take behind the scenes, and it makes this an acceptable thing that the legislature is putting on the ballot in May?
Well, I'm not sure how much I can talk about it, can I? But, well, there was a lot, and I want Katherine actually to, once you start and I'll finish up, because she actually started the negotiations, I came in to help push it over the edge. So it'd be fair for her to go first, and I can come behind it.
All this time I was hoping to be the backup singer. So as you know, it's incredibly difficult to give up power. It's just incredibly difficult to say, hey, we've been running the game, for 20 some years, maybe longer, and to say, hey, we're going to give this up, especially at a point where the map-making tools, which I think Dave can speak more about, but the map-making tools are so very good. So it's just hard to cede power. And we know that they looked at the proposal and they said, hey, why don't we see if we can come up with a bipartisan way to do this? And the thing that I would highlight about those negotiations is that it was a little bit like arm wrestling, right? And so there are lots of times I'm very disappointed in democracy. I just, like a lot of us, I have this idea in my head about how great it can be and the deliberation and how great it can be. And then you're in these rooms and you're like, this is like making sausage. However, the way that they approached the reining in the worst excesses of gerrymandering, and that was really what much of the conversation was about. Greg can talk a little bit more about this, but the way that they talked about reining in the worst excesses, one was to say, okay, we're going to do bipartisan map making. So we'll start with bipartisan map making. Think about this. In one of the most polarized times that we have been going through, just think about your lifetime and just think, certainly there were times during, late 60s, early 70s where we were incredibly polarized. There were all sorts of difficult conversations going on. Like you can start to think, you can go back and you can think about the civil rights era. You can go back and start to think about different times when we've been very polarized, but this is way up there, right? But in one of the most polarized times, Democrats came together, Republicans came together at the State House to identify the possibility of reform. And so they said, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to nip at the worst excesses by doing bipartisan map making. And so basically it's the legislature, but 50% of both major parties. So there's that. The other way always to nip at the worst excesses is transparency, right? Because if you can see what's going on, you can participate in improving it, right? And one of the things I really like in this proposal is the citizens' participation part. So we actually had long conversations about why it was important to actually include citizen participation in map making. Because, there are lots of people in this room that are never going to make a map. There are also people in this room that will want to make maps and will want to participate. And we can testify really directly that way. The other thing it did is that, you know what? If the Democrats and Republicans cannot keep it together, right, in the map making, then it goes to one party doing it, but the rules are so tough that anyone could do it, right? So that you make them super tough, plus you have a justification for how you draw the district lines. So good anti-gerrymandering criteria plus the justification in writing will make it much easier to take them to court. So those conversations were very difficult. And there was one time I was sure it was over. And they called the next day, and I was like, really? I thought it was over. We literally did a press release where we're like, we're taking our ball and going home. And yet it continued. And I'm going to throw it to Greg.
Well, and while all this is going on, I think it's important to remember what was going on outside of Ohio. There was the Virginia election. There was the Alabama election. Mm-hmm. There were the Supreme Court rulings. Mm-hmm. I think they were seeing something that was happening on the other side, or on the Republican side. And I also believe these petitioners were getting not just 50,000, 100,000, 120,000, 130,000. They were getting up into the 190,000 range when they started saying we have to stay at the table. When it hit 200,000 and it looks like we were home free for being on the ballot, I think they felt like they had to do something before the wave came. And so I think this is driving some of the thinking, is that we better put something together here so that we can at least have a process that we have some sense of control where the legislators can have the first crack at drawing the lines, or get ready for that commission that passed in 2015 to be the overall commission for everything. So they were really afraid of the commission being the absolute vehicle for doing this rather than the legislature taking the first step. Now, the good part is that we were able to preserve the use of the commission in the second round of the proposal if, in fact, they don't come up with a bipartisan map that has majority, that has a 60% margin, and it was 50% of the minority party, actually. Now, they started off by saying only 1/3 of the minority party had to sign off on the map in order for it to go through. They wanted to get rid of the governor as a person and part of the whole process. They wanted to get rid of the referendum as a process, as a check and balance. They said no to a lot of the standards that were being set. And this whole point of using guardrails to have some sense of order in this process is what had never happened in Ohio. So they basically, I thought they moved more than we did. I mean, they basically kept coming back to the table. And I think even the Democrats were saying this will never happen, Greg. But I got a sense that this wave is real. It's driving some of the psychological thinking. If somebody was here from the Republican Party who may want to think or say something different, I would certainly want to hear what that is. But I really believe they saw these petition drives as real. People from across the state in all counties, urban, rural, conservative, liberal, blue, and red, were signing these petitions. And it was over, what was the percentage in 2015? It was 69%?
Yes.
And so that's what I think they saw. Now, let me just say this, because I don't know how much time we have. Our recent polling shows that that we're not quite there yet. People still are confused by this. One of the reasons why this forum is important is because we really need to get a chance to help explain some of this and why it's such a good thing. But many people are skeptical that something that had both the Republican and the Democratic buy-in could be a good thing. And so we want to talk about why it's important to get rid of that myth.
We're getting more really good questions than we would ever fit in the next 3 days. So let me just try to see whether we're in agreement on a couple things to move them through. I got a few questions about the pending Supreme Court cases, one brought by Democrats upset about the maps in Wisconsin, one brought by Republicans upset about a particular district in Maryland, so it's bipartisan. It's kind of my belief, see if everybody agrees, and then we'll move on to the next question, is that while the Supreme Court is going to decide whether there would be a test, generally speaking, I think most people believe that they'll decide whether or not to apply a test of whether gerrymandering is illegal. The court previously had said gerrymandering for political purposes is illegal, but they never applied a test, so we might get a test this time. We don't know what the answer is, but with that lingering over, do we agree that maybe that was another thing that was pushing them toward doing something?
So I would agree that it will it definitely help push them along. So the thing that's interesting about the Wisconsin case is it looks at a gerrymander standard or a way to identify gerrymandering. The Benesek, which is the Maryland case, focuses more on the First Amendment. That in fact, as opposed to saying, hey, you need to have a standard for gerrymandering, what it does is it says, hey, if in fact you are changing a district because you don't like how voters vote, you are interfering with their First Amendment rights, and you just have to not do that, which is slightly different. So it's interesting to think that, so the Supreme Court could go two different ways. They could say it's like an equal protection thing. They could come up with a gerrymander standard and say, hey, we like this. Or they could say, hey, you should not violate First Amendment rights by playing around with the rules of government.
And then we got a question here specifically for David. Your book, you state that there's no perfect state redistricting system, that all have certain flaws. So the question is, what do you think are the essential elements of a good redistricting system? And I don't know to what extent you've had a chance to study this proposal in Ohio, maybe how that fits into there.
It's a great question. I mean, and the thing that makes it so hard is that there's a lot of tension between the various elements that you would want to have in a plan. You want a plan that represents the partisan balance of a state, right? But you also want competitive districts, and sometimes there's a tension there. You want to hold communities of interest together and you want to hold counties and towns together. Except Democrats tend to congregate in cities and Republicans live more spread out in rural areas and suburbs. So it becomes tricky to draw a map that looks pretty and still gets you towards fairness. So you have to balance all of these different standards when you are trying to design a process. And I think that we can learn a little bit from every state that has tried this. I mean, Iowa essentially hands it over to a bunch of bureaucrats and says, you can't use any political data, just use population, and draw the lines. Well, it's really easy in Iowa, a state that's very white and very square. Politically and culturally, right? And so, you know, it's fairly easy to pull that off in Iowa. You can't simply take the Iowa model and transport it to other states. In Arizona, they tried to put together a commission. They gave it strict criteria, largely based around holding together communities of interest and compactness, with competitiveness a little bit lower down. And they set it up trying to take it out of the hands of a very conservative state legislature in Arizona. And essentially, you got the independent districting in Arizona because the business community in Arizona got so frustrated with the state of politics there. You remember they were ending Martin Luther King holidays, and concerts wouldn't come to the state, and the Super Bowl wouldn't come, and the NCAA tournament. And that got the Republican business community saying, okay, let's do something about this. And they put together a commission that had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans and 1 independent. And both sides immediately began an assault on the integrity of the commission. Republicans did so more loudly and obnoxiously with regard trying to impeach the independent chair. And they took the integrity of the commission all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Democrats did it sort of more subtly and behind the scenes. They kind of gamed the appellate court process to sneak a Trojan horse on as the independent chair, and then made sure that they ran the mapping, that the mapping consultants were actually a Democratic firm, and they won a pretty positive map on their side. And I say this because these fights are really hard, and these fights are long, and they've gone on here for decades, and they're not over if you win. You have got to keep your eyes on this from the very next day. Politicians get away with gerrymandering, and they cling so tenaciously to the power to draw these lines, as we've seen in Pennsylvania over the course of the last several weeks since the Supreme Court there mandated a new map, and you see the Republicans today moving to impeach the 4 Democratic Supreme Court justices that demanded the new maps. And they cling to these lines because the maps matter. This is how power is held on to. And the trick with every commission, to me, whether you're talking about the bipartisan ones in New Jersey or Washington State, whether you're talking about the so-called independent ones in California or Arizona, or whether you're talking about what you want to do here, is creating really strict criteria and then watching like a hawk and not stopping, because they will find the loopholes. They are incentivized to find the loopholes. And after you've pushed a rock up the hill and told all your people, well, this is going to solve our problem, it might, but you've got to be sure, redistricting is the ultimate trust, but verify.
So we got a few questions about what are we voting on. I guess we didn't address that. Currently in Ohio, the way the congressional district lines, let's separate that, State House has done a little bit differently. Congressional district lines, there essentially are no, as it stands today, no specific rules in Ohio for how you do it. They need to follow federal law and things like the Voting Rights Act and not disenfranchising minority groups and keeping the districts about the same. But other than that, they need to keep the districts together and can come up with any system. That's how we ended up with a district that starts in Cleveland, or in, I think, as far as the west side of, or east side of Parma, and goes all the way to the west side of Toledo, stretching just narrowly along the lake. And there's another district, Jim Jordan's district in Lorain County, that starts in Lorain County, maneuvers around a couple prisons, works its way down to the north and west side of Columbus, and then within 12 miles of the Indiana border, because there's nothing to say you have to have it local or anything. So what's in the proposal? There's lots of things in the proposal, but I think those who worked on it would agree. Some of the key things is it limits how many times you can divide counties. I think it's 65 counties have to stay all by themselves. There's a limit, I think it's 5, that wouldn't be able to divide it more than 3 ways. Right now, Cuyahoga and Summit County, for example, are in parts of 4 different districts, but none of the districts are entirely within either of these large counties. Cleveland and Cincinnati would have their own. You can't split them anymore under this proposal. They would have their own district. And they stopped short of requiring it, but it kind of pushes it to. They should try to keep a district within Cuyahoga County and a district within Hamilton County. Columbus doesn't really apply to that because Columbus is bigger than what is a district, but there's supposed to be efforts made to keep as much of it in one district as possible. And then on the bipartisan thing, there's a whole series of complicated measures of step 1, step 2, step 3. But basically, the first set, right now, the Ohio legislature, Ohio Senate, and the Ohio House approve a map, and it goes to the governor. And last time, Governor Kasich signed it, despite what he said about the bad things about gerrymandering now. As it stands in the future, if this is approved, it would still go through the Ohio House, Ohio Senate with some of these rules about county splits and so forth. But significantly, it wouldn't get passed unless 50% of the second largest party agrees to it. So if the Democrats are still in the minority, 50% of them would have to go along with it before that could move forward. If they can't agree to that, it goes to a 7-member commission in which at least 2 minority members, am I getting all this right? At least 2 minority members would have to say yes for it to go forward. If that fails, it goes back to the legislature. The bar starts dropping about the minority support, but as Katherine pointed out, then there are more rules added to the process about how you can gerrymander things. They don't say gerrymandering in the language, but how they can gerrymander things.
Favor or disfavor?
Favor. So there's a whole series of things. The point is there's nothing now. There would be something in the future. I think the way I've described it is that the politicians still have their hands in the cookie jar, but there's grandmas looking around the corner to see whether they're doing things they shouldn't be doing. But so that's where we're at now. Now, that's a little bit different than the petitions that a number of you people have circulated that was much more strict on some of these things. Mm-hmm. And that brings up another question. The petitions had a proposal to do, well, basically even out the number of Democrats and Republicans to reflect past votes in Ohio. So, like right now in Congress in Ohio, we've consistently under these maps had 75% of the seats held by Republicans. They've won those seats with a little bit more than 50% of the vote. The idea would be it would be closer to represent the vote, going in a complicated way back into history. That's not in this proposal. That was in the petitions. And what are some of the other key differences between what the petition circulated? A lot of these people circulated petitions, and what's in the proposal.
So this is a more modest compromise. One of the things that I always, when we think about compromise, what I look for is mitigating the worst behaviors, and that's what this does. Is what are the worst things that happen? Well, they do it in secret. Well, this opens it up and gives us tools so that we can participate and make maps. What else was terrible? One party drew the district lines. So it starts out with saying, hey, let's do this as 2-party map making. The problem is it's possible that they won't be able to come up with a map. at the end, it says if you only have one party, then you rein that map making in by saying no lines shall be drawn, no district map shall be drawn to favor or disfavor a political party or incumbent. The incumbent is important because, of course, there are many more incumbents of one party than the other, and incumbency protection is one of the things that have been understood by the courts to be of some good. The other thing that I think is very good that's included in that focuses on compactness, focuses on keeping communities together as much as whole, counties whole if possible, than municipalities and cities. The other thing that I keep going back to is if you're going to give it to just one party to do it, having that written justification actually is very useful because they can't write, for example, I did this to benefit my own political party. It will make it easier to work its way through the court. Now, keep in mind, sometimes we need the courts to rein in the worst excesses as well. So that is also in this proposal by saying, hey, we need a good written justification. And I always think, sunlight is the best disinfectant. That idea, like that Dave was talking about, that we need to be engaged throughout this process. Even if this was a perfect or as close to perfect plan, things can go wildly wrong in actual practice. And so I'm super glad that we have the citizen participation part of issue 1.
Can I just add a few things about the proposal? It's a small window of time when all this has to work right. In 2021, the bill sets forth that the map decision has to be voted on by September 30th, 2021. If they can't reach agreement by, the 30th of September, then it goes to stage 2, where the commission then comes in and tries to come up with the map that has a bipartisan basis. If that fails, then it goes to phase 3, which is the worst option for us. We fought against that phase 3, but we're not able to win it. That's one of the few things we did lose. But that phase 3 then lowers the threshold for minority sign-off to 1/3. And then I guess it puts them back in a position of being able to draw their own maps for a shorter period of time. But we do have the right of referendum at the end of that. I think we kept that in there.
So we did. We did also keep in the right of referendum.
Right.
Now, anybody who's done a referendum, it's 90 days and it's just a slog and terrible. That being said, the ability to say, okay, y'all made this map. It is so genuinely awful. We are collecting signatures. There's some power in that. I don't know about you, but I would be ready to collect a bunch of signatures if the map is genuinely terrible. And who's with me?
Well,
hey, back there.
But David is absolutely right. You got to watch this all the way through the process. We're just talking now about getting it through the ballot in May, but the process of this thing going through and actually being implemented requires some 3-year vigilance. The key thing is the results of the 2018 and the 2020 election for both the legislature and for the governor. So this is extremely important. The governor that's elected this year will be the governor who signs or vetoes that bill in 2021. That's right. It was 10 years ago. And so this is extremely important for us to make this. Now, we haven't said this. I don't want to confuse anybody, but if this thing fails, which is possible because we're not supposed to talk about these numbers, but the numbers aren't high in the sky. There's a lot of uncertainty about this. If it fails, then we have to go back to the fail-safe procedure of getting these signatures and ready for a ballot fight in November. So this is an attempt to keep that from having to happen. We don't want it to happen because we don't have the resources to fight a battle and the governor and the Senate race all at the same time.
But Greg, what if it passes? And if some of these petitioners believe that this petition was still a better plan than what's being presented in May, could that potentially go to the ballot in November?
I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is yes, and I think the answer is that it's one of those things that would come up that we would have a cataclysmic situation on our hands because a lot of people would be for that ballot measure, and I think the courts would have to decide which one would trump the other one.
So
maybe you could figure that one out.
So it is my understanding that if this passes and when you're voting, You're voting against this proposal versus the status quo.
Right, exactly.
I mean, it's this proposal versus basically, hey, have your way with the pen and create maps however the heck you want. So if that passes, we would actually have to go to court to progress with the citizen signature gathering. Oh, so why? Because we would have changed the Ohio Constitution. And we'd have to have an argument that when we started collecting, the Ohio Constitution was this way, not that way, and it's not clear how that would turn out. The one thing that I would highlight to you all is citizen initiatives pass in the past 25 years at about 42%. So I have to tell you, it was very hard for me to put down my pen and stop collecting signatures. I mean, this was incredibly difficult. And to know that, yes, he too had a hard time putting down his pen and his phone. I love that ringtone, don't you? It's a good one. So I guess for how many of you in this room have had a really hard time putting down your pen and saying, hey, yes, issue 1? And she says she hasn't. Right. So I think it makes sense to collect as insurance, but we need to remember how hard it is to actually pass these citizen initiatives. And one of the things that our friends, shall I say, in the legislature of a specific party suggested that they would spend a ton of money against us. And so, like all compromises, this is difficult. But if you're actually getting at the worst excesses, and we have that ability to be engaged and in a more transparent process and do our own maps, this is a good beginning. Ooh, did you hear what she said? Don't let better be the enemy of good enough.
Let me, if I could.
I collected a lot of signatures. People called me and said, oh, you got it on for May. And I have to say, no, it's not the same. And people don't know that. When I collected, in good faith, people said to me, I'm not sure because a lot of times it changes when it hits the ballot. And I assured this guy, no way, you know? And so now I am really angry about this. I mean, personally, because I feel like a liar to these people.
Well, I think you shouldn't feel, I would not feel like, can I tell you a little story that I went through in 2011? The Ohio legislature passed a very egregious bill called H.R. 194, HB 194. It basically got rid of early voting. It got rid of Golden Week. It made it very difficult to count provisional ballots. It basically put us 35 years back in Ohio law, and it all came in one big omnibus bill. And so I got, at the request of former Secretary of State Jennifer Brunner, we got together, we formed something called Fair Elections Ohio. We went around the state. We got with the Obama campaign, and we actually, and Labor, we actually collected over 300,000, we collected almost 500,000 signatures to get on the ballot to repeal the law. And we won, we got the numbers. It was certified by the Secretary of State's office, but lo and behold, the legislature came in and said, why don't we just repeal that law? Because we don't want you all to have this big ballot measure on in 2012, because they were trying to do what? Defeat Barack Obama. So to do that, you didn't want a high-powered voting rights bill on the ballot that would jack up the black vote, for lack of a better term, and the progressive vote and the labor vote. And labor was at the same time fighting this battle for pushing back against collective bargaining rollbacks. They won that battle. Remember that. We won that battle. So they saw that ball coming down the pike and decided to take this off the ballot. So we thought illegally, took our ballot initiative off the ballot and then repealed the law in its entirety, with the exception of two things, which was early voting and no fault. That was the piece that the weekend voting thing you've been hearing about was the one thing they left in there, and we were able to get them to repeal everything else. But were there people angry back then because they had repealed something? They wanted to be a rebuke to the legislature, And we were accused of pulling it off the ballot. We didn't pull it off. Secretary of State Houston pulled it off the ballot. But we had to lay down our pens, too. And I was ready for a real big campaign, but we just couldn't when we had a chance to get rid of it through the legislative process. So that's what just happened here. We went through the legislative process to get what the people who wrote petitions and signed petitions wanted. We got as close to the end as we could get. And we know it's not exactly what's in the measure, but we thought we really were running out of time and energy and places to go. So people like David and others across the country can evaluate that. But I know, can I just tell you, I want to keep talking, but I had a meeting with former Attorney General Holder 2 weeks ago, and they were reviewing the prospects of this bill, giving him the whole lineup of what was happening. He said he read through this entire summary, and he kept looking for the bad parts, he said. And he kept thinking, where's the bad part that's going to come and grab us at the end, saying, okay, here's the killer pill. And he said he couldn't find it. So he is a good direction for me to follow, that you guys did a great job negotiating this from an organization, from a Congress, from a legislature that is a super majority Republican. And we never forgot that. We were negotiating with a super majority in both the House and the Senate, and Republican office holders in all 5 statewide offices. So we really didn't have a whole lot of backup if this didn't work.
There's a few legal questions that came up. A couple people have asked, well, what happens if the Supreme Court rules? How would it impact this? I guess that's kind of difficult to attack without seeing what the Supreme Court says. We've got a question here. If it gets through, we talked about this multi-layer process. If it gets all the way down to the end and you can't get enough bipartisan support, they can still pass a map for 4 years. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So the question being, what would happen if it really got to that end process and get there? Does that open the door for legal for courts to overturn this? I mean, is that like one other fail-safe clear at the end if you can't get both parties on board?
So this is a problem. I listened to what she was saying, and I was listening to what he said, and now I have no idea what the question is. Sorry.
Well, the question being, if you got to the end and you didn't have minority buy-in, so they passed a map that was short 4. Is there yet one more fail-safe that the courts would say, wait, you didn't follow the rules?
So absolutely. So once you get to the 4th step, there's the rules about, basically you draw the district map so that it doesn't favor or disfavor one political party or another, or one incumbent over another. There's a rule about keeping communities together, so counties whole, then municipalities, then cities. There's a compactness requirement. There's a requirement to put it in like what you're actually, the map making is actually, your justification for why it looks like this in writing. It's only for 4 years, but it does rein in some of the worst excesses. It's not like they can do the snake on the lake. They're clearly, shall we say, they clearly could have a little bit of fun, but they still have to go through that written justification. And if, in fact, the map is genuinely terrible, we can referendum it, or we could actually take them to court. How do we take them to court? See me afterwards.
If they went to step 3, that's legal. So
you can actually challenge, like you could take them either to state court and challenge that, in fact, they did violate the rule about favoring or disfavoring one political party. You could take them to court about whether they broke up communities inappropriately. There are different places that you could do that in state court. And then depending on what happens with the federal level court, we could have a different kind of challenge about creating district lines, whether it's the First Amendment argument or gerrymander standard. We could do it that direction, but we don't actually know what's going to happen with the Supreme Court meaning the U.S. Supreme Court at this point.
So, David, we got a question that maybe falls into a lot of what you addressed in your book, is that the result of all this gerrymandering, and there are people like Governor Kasich's been out there saying that's why you have people on the right and left and fewer people in the middle now. Can you talk about, I don't know whether we can predict the future, but if we hadn't had gerrymandering now, how would that potentially have changed Congress's makeup, or any thoughts on that in general about what that's done to not necessarily how many Democrats and how many Republicans have, but how government functions?
We've got about 35 legitimate swing districts left in this country out of 435. That means that in 400 of 435 districts, you pretty much know who is going to win that election before you even go to the polls. That's not good for democracy in just about any way. You don't have to turn out and vote in these elections. If you are the legislator from these districts, you really need only concern yourself with what the base of your party there thinks, because you're trying to fend off a primary campaign. You don't care about the general election because that's in the bag. So we end up, we've seen these two trends accelerating over the course of the last 15, 20 years in our politics. And one is the collapse of swing districts and the growth of these deeply ideological, bright red and deep blue landslide districts. And then we've also seen the collapse of bridge builders in Congress, of folks who are able to work with and talk to both sides. So, I mean, it used to be, and when I say used to be, you only have to go back to the mid-1990s for this, that there were still conservative Democrats, and there were liberal Republicans, and there were centrists of all stripes. And these were the people who could talk to both sides and kind of get something fashioned together. And when essentially uncompetitive districts breeds this kind of extremism in our politics, it pushes everything towards both sides, and it makes it largely impossible to get anything done, even on issues where the vast majority of people agree. I mean, we are told that things like immigration or guns are these insanely hot-button controversial issues. They're really not. There's terrific consensus on a path forward on most of these issues. We can't have this because our politicians have been incentivized by these districts to behave in such a way that it does not solve problems. Indeed, so if we think of politics as the art of compromise and working together and getting things done, they're incentivized to do the exact opposite. They're incentivized to protect their flank against a primary and somebody saying, I'm even crazier than this person. And my favorite example of this is out of North Carolina, which had been a deeply competitive state at the congressional level throughout the 2000s. And in 2010, the Republican red map play gives them complete control of drawing maps in North Carolina. There's 13 congressional districts there. They are determined to draw a 10-3 map. Why a 10-3 map? Well, the state rep in charge of this says, I don't think I can draw an 11-2 map. So to draw a 10-3 map, he takes the city of Asheville, which is kind of this hippie, liberal, vegan cafe, independent bookstore town in the western mountains part of the state that's surrounded by the more conservative parts of the state, but it's the biggest city out there. And it had been represented by one of those conservative Democrats, a guy named Heath Schuler, who some of you might remember as a quarterback in the pros. And Schuler takes one look at the lines that they've drawn from him by cracking Asheville literally in half and putting half of it in one conservative district and half of it in another conservative district. And he says, I can't run here, I can't win here, I'm out. The guy who ends up representing this district wins the Republican primary on a platform of, I'm going to send Barack Obama back to Kenya or wherever it is he comes from. You can go onto YouTube and look this up. It's out there. And this is now the Republican congressman from the 10th District of North Carolina. His name is Mark Meadows. He is the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. What has the House Freedom Caucus done as far as pushing the direction of our politics? Like it or not, you can't say it hasn't had an impact. Mark Meadows is the guy who files the claim against John Boehner, the parliamentary motion to vacate the chair. So he does a job on his own party there. Mark Meadows is the guy who drives the 2013 shutdown. Mark Meadows is the guy who is pushing Trump care further to the right. Mark Meadows is the guy who is driving the last shutdown. So this is how districting changes the tone and tenor of our politics. It elects a different kind of candidate who then, when they get to Washington, behaves in a different kind of way.
So in the last 4 presidential elections before this one, Ohio was really down the middle. If you add up all the votes when Bush was elected twice and Obama was elected twice, it's nearly 50-50 on the money. It's like 50.2 to 48 or something like that. So that's the argument about having competitive districts. When you had a competitive state, as the state sentiments changed, it could go Democrat, Republican, and now this last election back Republican. But we haven't had that on the congressional side. I think the closest congressional elections in Ohio have been decided by like 20 points. So there has been no say to allow sentiment to go back and forth. That's the other argument that kind of goes in that.
And that's what happens. We lose the swing. So Republicans had a big year in 2010, and they should have taken control of all of the state legislative chambers and Congress. But Democrats had a big year in 2012, and it should have swung back, and it didn't. And it didn't swing back because the lines that the Republicans drew in state legislatures and in Congress provided a red firewall that was able to hold off a blue wave in state after state. Hundreds of thousands of votes essentially didn't matter because of the way that these lines were drawn to crack and pack the other side into districts where they were not able to elect a candidate of their choosing.
But on this issue that's going to be on the May ballot, while there's been talk about Republicans not wanting to change, it was unanimous in the Ohio House to put this on the ballot. It was overwhelmingly to put on the ballot in the House, unanimous in the Senate. Thanks, Greg. But yet, with that type of support, Greg's mentioned more than once tonight that he's concerned about whether the support's enough to pass it. So I got 2 questions on that line. One person asked how they get a yard sign. The other person asked, is there concern that outside groups will come in to try to fight against this? So anybody.
Do you want me to take the yard sign question?
You take the yard sign, and I'll take the outside group question.
So we should have yard signs in approximately 10 to 14 days. It's not exactly clear, and I appreciate you all being patient. As you know, it takes us a little while to rustle up a little money, but this is coordinated by the League of Women Voters of Ohio, 614-469-1505, and you can also put League of Women Voters Ohio in your Google search engine, come up with them, and contact them via email. And that's the way you can get yard signs. Bridget is the one who's coordinating it, and may make it easier if you ask for Bridget when you call.
There's a sign up if you want a yard sign outside.
And Katherine has been organizing the folks for the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland. And please sign up for a yard sign so we can let our neighbors and friends know.
But do you guys hear any whispering, any concerns, outside groups coming in to try to stop this?
Oh, I am. I mean, I'm concerned because I've seen it happen so many times before. I'm also skeptical to a certain degree that this vote, which was unanimous, was a little odd, but I thought it happened for altruistic reasons. But if there was this thing where we gave you your shot and you didn't get it, so you're done, and then we come in and do the big campaign against you in November, then that would be fait accompli. Game, set, match. Redistricting is dead in Ohio till the end of time. So we don't want that to happen. But outside groups who don't follow any particular party, there's no party discipline anymore in the Republican Party. There's a whole free reign of people who are hard right, who take control of different issues they care about and move money into this state or any other state when they want to. And if they see there's an open field, yes, it could happen. But we have to, as David said, watch every step of this way because we don't have a big war chest on our side. We would be vulnerable to an outside actor who came in with $1 million or $2 million could wipe us off the ballot. Now, I don't like to say that. I'm just saying that we have to remember how we got here, a citizens' initiative and a coalition building and a bipartisan approach. So we want to hang on to those 3 things until November 8th. And then then we'll see what comes up after that.
And Dave has a tale of dark money in redistricting, in case you want to hear that.
Probably many.
Yeah.
Which ones did you have in mind?
I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland here. And this is a great subpoint for a clarification I want to make. When you go, League of Women Voters obviously overwhelmingly supports issue 1. And we are doing everything in our power to make sure it passes on May 8th and pick up flyers out there to pass out to people to tell them. It will ask everyone you know to vote yes on issue 1 on May 8th. But when you go to our webpage to ask for the lawn signs or whatever, you'll find a notice saying we are also continuing to collect signatures. We're doing it in tandem. We carry our clipboard, we ask for signatures, and we ask them to vote for on May 8th. We do it because nothing is guaranteed in politics, not because we don't support issue 1, but because we want to be prepared to come back in November if something bad happens, and we don't want to look like we've taken off our activist sneakers so that the dark money feels free to come in. So please, if you want to continue to collect signatures while you advocate for issue 1, get in touch with us. Katherine LaCroix right here is your woman.
So she covers all her bases. She's a former federal prosecutor. So.
Ooh, Dave, dark money. Dark money.
What did you have in mind?
Ooh, I just know that dark money played a role during the 2010 elections, which set up the stage for the 2011 map making. And
True.
you know what? Because of my interest in money and politics, I always feel like that intersection of dark money and, shall we say, evil gerrymandering, that tale is interesting.
Well, I mean, Citizens United gets decided by the Supreme Court in January of 2010, right at the same time that all of the redistricting plans are being made. So it's not a coincidence that these two things are able to work together. That said, the Republicans were able to run this red map plan in 2010 for $30 million. That's nothing in American politics. I mean, I came out from Massachusetts. You can't lose a U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts for less than $100 million. But for $30 million, they were able to create a hammerlock on supermajorities in state legislatures across the country, as well as this control in Congress. I mean, it's the greatest political heist and political bargain in some ways in our politics. What I see here, and I haven't followed it as closely, obviously, as Rich or been at the table as you guys have, but it seems to me that they're afraid of you.
Because we're
A little
scary.
bit, you know? I mean, I don't think a 66-33 state house comes to the table easily when, what, not a single one of them in 2016 was in a double-digit race even? Like, not a single race was even within 10%. And I think I'm using your numbers here, I think, Rich. But I think upwards of 40% of them won by over 40%. So when politicians who are this comfortable in their gerrymandered districts are willing to negotiate these gerrymandered districts away, trust but verify, but the fact that they're coming to the table to me suggests that they're afraid of the energy of citizen signatures and citizen activism, particularly in this year. And when you see it across the country, when you see what your colleagues in Michigan and Wisconsin and Virginia and North Carolina and Oklahoma and South Dakota and Utah are all doing on this front, there's a lot of energy. And if I was dark money, I'm not sure I'd get in the way of it in May. It'll be interesting to watch. I'm bad at predictions, though. So
I guess
try not
dark
to make
money
them.
doesn't want to waste money, though, right?
Yeah, dark money is usually pretty smart. I mean, I guess they spent a lot of money on Rick Santorum back in the 2012 primaries, so, I mean, maybe not. But I don't think they necessarily want to waste it, especially if the Republicans were and both sides were involved in negotiating a compromise here. So it'll be interesting.
It's interesting that you mentioned it here, and your book goes into more detail about the $30 million that delivered what it did. And anybody that's looked at the reports that was prepared based on emails from the secret process a few years ago, see, you know, it's not inventing that as something important. When they were drawing up the proposals of the map, they said, well, these changes are going to result, and they put dollar figures on it about how many millions of dollars this was going to save the party because they were able to create these districts. In black and white, nobody put in words in it. It's right there in their own emails about the predictions of what it would save along that lines.
Yeah, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I actually have their PowerPoints and their emails.
I've always been amazed as a journalist what people put in emails and in writing.
Amen.
Later come out. The districting next time, though, it happens in 2011 for the first time, or 2021, presuming this passes. So for the first time, all these rules are put in place requiring minority support. Do you have any concern that still that the people voting on the maps are going to be the people that are seated by a gerrymandered district? Because, you know, the new maps for the State House won't take effect yet. So it's the old system, the system that was so skilled that in the first election when Obama was reelected, that the Democrats had more votes than the Republicans in the Ohio House races across the state, but only won like 41% of the seats. Right. Do you have that concern that it's not a fixed legislature yet that's addressing this, or you got enough rules in place that's going to prevent them from doing bad things?
So think about the circular, the going around and around in circles. It's not fixed yet. When you try to fix it, you can't fix it because it's broke. And you try to fix it and it's broke. I think what we do is the best that we can to mitigate the worst, and we move forward. You know, we should feel proud as people who have been collecting and continue to collect signatures, because we believe that people should have a voice, and that doesn't mean that things are going to turn out perfectly in 2021 and 2022. The goal is to try to mitigate the worst, try to move us on a path to have things better, and to tackle other issues in the future as well, including money in politics and better voter access. And you can start to think about all the other problems that we have right now, where if we could just mitigate each one a little bit, we would be on the path. But a cycle of thinking, hey, we're starting out bad, so how are we going to get better, just makes me really depressed. And I am an American and an Ohioan. And as a proud Buckeye, I believe that we can do something about this. I believe that we can have the democracy that we deserve. I believe the fact that we're in this room today is all about us saying, you know, this is what democracy looks like, right? You know, we are what democracy looks like. People coming in, we have a moderator, I interrupt the moderator. Susan's like, whoa, I'm over here. You know, this is what democracy looks like. And I think we should all be very proud. Doesn't mean it'll be perfect. Doesn't mean that there aren't pitfalls. It just means we've made tremendous progress.
Well, some of the things in the proposal. For instance, it calls for compact districts, but it doesn't define it. And maybe some people are critical of that, sometimes not. But by the very fact that those types of things on there, does that make it easier to bring a case if people were violating the spirit of that than if there was nothing written about compactness or nothing written about some of these other things?
The criteria that we were able to get, they never agreed to the full language on criteria.
So there are lots and lots of ways to define compactness. You know, a good example is you could do compactness as a circle, but of course, how do you do a bunch of districts that are actually a circle? So there are a bunch of different ways you could do compactness. We need to be watching the language that they create in the legislature to actually go through this process. What model? You know, Mark Selling's in the front. He might come up with some compactness criteria and give examples of how that could be very different. It does make a difference, and yet the notion of compactness is a lot clearer to people.
Mark Selling up here. We could talk about a lot of smart people in the room. The files and so forth that the politicians used to draw the maps in 1991, 2001, and 2011 were created by Mark. Now, he can't be responsible for what they did with them, but
I bet he knew, though. I bet he knew.
And the contract from Cleveland State University had a contract with the state, and Mark was the mapping expert there. So you know, those of us that mess around with maps and study this stuff and say, well, geez, but it could be this and that. But the people with the cameras probably get mad at me. But I want to ask Mark, because you know more, perhaps you see how the files are used more than anyone else. What are some of the good things and some of the things you're really going to watch for if this comes to be?
Well, thanks for asking. I applaud the effort, obviously, and I also urge people to continue to sign that petition for a couple different reasons. To get the ballot in November, get it on the ballot in November, whether or not this one passes in May. I do have concerns about the current proposal, and I wrote an op-ed piece in the Plain Dealer a couple weeks ago. Because
can you step up to the podium?
Apologize for the cameras.
Mark Selling.
Yeah, my name is Mark Salling. I'm at Cleveland State University. I applaud the effort. I think it is better than the way we have things done now. So that's very clear. But my fear is that it may only be marginally better. It still could very well result in a majority plan that means that our votes are not counted like they should be. It means that not as many in the minority party will win as the number of people in the state votes for that party. That's representational fairness. It would be very easy, I think, in this current plan to come up with a redistricting plan that still limits our votes, okay? So I've always advocated using measures. I'm a data person, right? So I believe that you could come up with metrics beforehand and say that you have to have representational fairness score of between this value and this value. You have to have this percentage of the districts which are competitive. You have to come up with a compactness score in this range. You have to not split communities of interest this much. And those are all measurable things. It's not just in the words, shall not have non-compact districts, shall represent the population and their voting. Those are nice words. And in court, you might be able to make a case about it, but I'll come back to that. But you could actually measure these things, and it's been demonstrated that the public can participate by actually, on the internet, using software, draw districts and submit them and have them scored using these criteria, and then allow a commission to then pick from the best 5 scoring plans, okay? And give the citizens, us, the ability to propose plans that met the criteria that we all can agree to: competitive districts, representational fairness, compactness, splitting of communities of interest, okay? You can measure those things. It's been demonstrated twice. Secretary of State Bruner hired us to help with the process back in 2009, thank you, to do this, and you were involved in that. And it showed that every plan that was submitted on the internet, using really actually software is much more difficult than is available now, every plan that was submitted by a citizen outscored the plan in existence that was drawn by the politicians. Okay, and then more recently, the Midwest Democracy Institute, I believe is their name, Network, thank you, did a similar thing with software which was even better. And every plan that was submitted by citizens scored better than the existing plan produced by the politicians, because they had a set of criteria and they had a way of measuring those criteria, and they came up with the results. So I would love to see a plan like that. It's not going to happen. I recognize that, okay? But I've always advocated, I'm an idealist.
So, but what I would say is because there is a requirement in this to give us the tools to make maps, we could identify criteria that we would like to see. One of the things that can make a huge difference in court, and also, shall we say, public pressure, is to have some citizen maps. If all the citizen maps are actually way better and you know, more competitive, more compact, all of the different things that you like, your communities together, we will have an opportunity to put pressure on them during the legislative process. And then at the end, if we need to, many don't love the idea of going to court, but we have the ability to say, hey, they said this, and here we have these actual maps to push back against the notion that they just couldn't possibly come up with anything better, which is what I'm sure Rich alluded to that before. I really believe that the citizen engagement part of this is one of the best ones.
I'm very hopeful, and I hope that's the way it works. But my concern, and I'll give credit to my colleague Bill Sparrow, who's sitting back there, points out that should it go all the way and the majority party creates a plan that we would all consider to be unfair, but they do it anyway. If you take them to court, what's a court going to say, especially one that may be leaning towards the majority party? They're going to say, everybody swore this was a bipartisan process. Now you're objecting to it? So we're promoting this as a bipartisan plan, but if we have to take it to court, the courts could very easily say, you all agreed. What are you having a problem with now?
Well,
so I do understand that you could still make the argument in a court that they didn't follow some of the words in the third stage that says you've got to be compact, you shouldn't favor one party. Again, those are not measurable, or they are measurable, but they're not measured. And you can argue about whether it's representative or not, or whether there are enough competitive districts or not, or whether they're compact enough. And so a court could say, we can't measure these things. We can't tell whether your allegations about their not meeting the goal of the words in the document. So you all agreed it was a bipartisan process. That's it.
Could I ask whether or not the map or the plan that people are signing petitions for now would have the same criticisms from you, or would that just be from this document? In other words, with those same conditions of the ability of them to draw their own majority map, could the commission do the same? Could the same flaw fall within the commission?
I think the commission idea still has flaws, but I think it's probably better than the current proposal that voted on.
Be better.
Because it does have more specific wording about representational fairness, competitiveness, etc. So some of that wording got washed back.
It did.
In compromise, and I understand.
Yeah, we tried to get it to the very, very last day, and we couldn't get it.
So I want to make it clear, I'm not telling you not to vote for this thing in May. I very well might vote for it in May. Okay?
Maybe. Thanks.
I'm really torn about it, but it's definitely better than what we have now. Okay? Thank you for the opportunity.
So we got lots of questions I didn't get to. Apologize. Lots of good questions here. We just have a couple minutes to wrap up. What we do have to decide on in May, if you're a voter, is yes or no. We don't get all these other choices this time around. So we just have a couple minutes, but maybe quickly go through yes or no and why. You're not an Ohio voter, but we'll give you a Ohio vote tonight.
No one tell Chris Kobach. I think that reform is a long, hard road, especially in a state where it's been gerrymandered to the extent that it has here. And if you look across the board at the states that have something a little bit closer to partisan fairness and representational proportionality in their chambers and in their congressional delegations, it's states where there is a certainty that both parties are going to be represented at the table. So I certainly think that one of the amazing things about the technology that has made these gerrymanders possible is that it's also made it possible to see through them and to have them be measured exactly and clearly, and to have a supercomputer run 25,000 different maps using these criteria, and to see that 99.8% of them are fairer than the ones that the politicians actually enacted. The other side of that is sometimes 8th graders are able to draw maps that are better than the ones that the politicians enacted. That just happened in Pennsylvania as well. And I also fear that that this technology is not getting any better. Excuse me, that it's not getting worse. And in 2021, as they are drawing these maps, they're going to have the advantage of better algorithms, stronger data, and even more predictive power. This is a really long way of answering a yes or no question. You have to vote yes when it's in front of you, and you have to take what is here. I have watched Katherine at a distance and her team for years fighting for this kind of a democracy in this state, and I think she's earned the trust of everybody in this room and everybody in the state, and that the compromise that she's worked out is the first step we take. And then we come back and we keep fighting for more. And we thank her for the work of the incredibly hard work of fighting for a democracy. And none of us stop, not one day.
Greg, we're going to give you your Cleveland vote back for tonight.
Well, I was following his answer and wanted to make sure where it ended up, so I'm glad you ended where you did end up, Dave. But
yes,
I had a rebuttal ready for it, but I'm good. We're good. Because you came so far. But well, look,
I'm trying to address a lot of things.
In the civil rights movement, we've learned that a lot of these things, these battles, are compromises. You know, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a compromise. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a compromise because we were dealing with forces fighting on both sides very hard. And I worked on the National Voter Registration Act for 6 years, and it was a compromise that passed. We wanted same-day voter registration, universal voter registration. That's how it started. It ended up being motor voter and agency-based registration and postcard registration. But when I started working on that bill, it was illegal to register people to vote with the postcard in 24 states in 1993. So these things are compromises, and one of the reasons I was attracted to this bill was because it was a shot that we had that we could get this through even a supermajority House and Senate. I didn't think it was possible. I thought we should at least give it a shot. We talked about this. In fact, we were in North Carolina last year talking about what states had prospects. This was not considered a state that had any chance of passing this. So my vote will obviously be yes because we got as far as we can get. But I also believe, as David said, at the very end, we can do better, but we have to get through this point first. If we lose this point, and we're back at zero. I'm not saying we can't get this other ballot measure. I will be the first one trying to help with signatures and turn out the vote. That's what I do for a living. But I don't want us to have to do that if we could get as far as we can get on this one. And then if we elect the right people in 18 and 20, I can guarantee you the push will be there to strengthen what we did in 2018 to have a much better and more open and more democratic situation. I think that's when we can declare victory. But right now, let's at least win this battle and get ourselves to the next stage of our democracy.
I think that redistricting reformers, and there are many in this room, are some of the most persistent and hopeful and committed people. And I just wanted to say thank you to you all. I plan on voting yes because I believe it's a step forward. I believe that it nips at the worst excesses of gerrymandering. I believe that if you're not at the table when it comes to the map making, you're the meal. And so as we move forward and have lots more conversations, I'm hoping we're doing something very exciting to improve other issues as we go forward. So I'm starting to think about automatic voter registration, money in politics, dark money. There are all sorts of other things that we could be working on, but we should also keep an eye on this. I think the citizen engagement portion is so important. And I just wanted to, once again, just say thank you to you all. I have been so moved the past year and a little bit more in change. You all are wonderful, and thank you.
And thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. Where?
Akron.